All right. Since it's 12:05, um, we are going to go ahead and get started. Once again, thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to do a quick intro to the museum and our speaker series, just for people who have not been here before and have not joined us for any Decoding the Past events. So, Decoding the Past is an ongoing speaker series hosted by the Paul Gray PC Museum at Claremont Graduate University. My name is Anna Atkeson, and I'm the museum's executive director and a recent graduate of the master's program in cultural and museum studies at CGU. For today's session, Computing Legacies, Digital Cultures of Simulation, we're hosting a conversation with our guest, Dr. Peter Krapp, professor of film and media studies at UC Irvine. I'd like to start today by sharing a brief introduction to the Paul Gray PC Museum. The museum's founder, Paul Gray, arrived at Claremont in 1983 to establish the Center for Information Systems and Technology, better known today as CISAT. While founding CISAT here at CGU, Professor Gray also began amassing a collection of personal computers. His collection focused on tracking changes in computer technology with an eye for its relationships with people. After an 18-year career at CGU, Professor Gray retired in 2001 and founded the Paul Gray Personal Computing Museum, donating his collection to CGU in the hopes that friends, colleagues, and students would build upon his work. Today, the museum traces the history of personal computing over the last 50 years, always with Paul Gray's original focus on how computers transform our lives in mind. Thanks to the transdisciplinary collaboration between CISAT and the School of Arts and Humanities, the museum continues to flourish by developing new partnerships, resources, and programming like today's Decoding the Past. You can check out a list of our previous Decoding the Past events on our event page, and I will drop that in the chat right now. Oh, I had the Zoom link copied, so give me just a second to get that events link copied. There we go. Uh, so that's the link to our event page where all of our upcoming events are announced, and you can watch the recordings of all our past events. You can see, additionally, if you subscribe to our blog, which you can do from the blog drop-down menu in our navigation bar, you'll get email notifications of new event announcements as well. If you follow that link, you will also see an option to donate to the museum on the right of the page. If you're able, I'd really like to encourage you to consider a donation of any amount. Donations help ensure the continued success of the museum and events like Decoding the Past, while providing CGU students like myself with an amazing opportunity for professional growth. Awesome. Okay, now let's get on to the main event. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today and for all the work you've put into the event. Just a reminder for our audience, we'll be opening up for audience questions at the end, so feel free to use the chat and the question Q&A function throughout the event if anything comes to mind. And I'll keep an eye on any questions that you pose through either of those functions, and we'll address them after Peter is done presenting. With that said, I will hand the mic over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm happy to be on your screen, although part of me does wish that we could do this in the actual museum environment, because one thing that will become obvious very quickly is that I've been going to a lot of computer museums in the process of researching this recent book that came out last December, which is called Computing Legacies, Digital Culture of Simulation. And there's a whole chapter in there about museums of computing, because in my job here at UC Irvine, I've been covering digital culture not just as something oriented towards the present or the future, but it's increasingly clear that there is a history of digital media, a history of computing, a legacy, a heritage that we share, and that continues to shape how we communicate, how we entertain each other, how we consume things, how we educate ourselves and other people, etc. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the book as such, but I'm going to focus on museums of computing and the challenges that they face in contributing to some form or other of stewardship of our computing legacies. So let me put slides in the ground instead of my head, and then I will try to get out of the way of what you're expecting to see. So um, MIT Press published this book in December of last year. It has three main claims to make. One is that there is a whole history of simulation as one of many cultural techniques that enable us to do symbolic work and allow us to work with thought experiments and hypotheses and um, speculative ideas and scenarios. So simulation is something properly computational, but it also is older than that. Secondly, simulation and the tools developed in the course of computing such are not just about future scenarios, risk mitigation, pilot training, or the like, or physical modeling. It can also turn into something that is very helpful in preserving our cultural memory, where modeling and emulation, which I'll talk about in some detail, and serious play have become very constitutive to how we relate to media history. And then finally, the book overall is also arguing that simulation and the way that we think about that cultural technique is also a critique of the digital age as we have organized it for ourselves, especially once you see that there could be a counterfactual perspective that the story of computing, the story of simulation could have gone in different directions. It'll become very clear that we are not somehow at the logical endpoint of a development. And very quickly, an overview of the book. It really tries to put simulation at the center of computing legacies. It is trying to interrogate both technical computing history and media studies scholarship to show how simulation can allow us to articulate certain questions about cultural memory, media history. And it does draw on some disciplines outside the humanities, although I'm fully aware that I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody who is working in media studies and in the humanities, even as I am drawing on a number of other disciplines. One starting point is a recent UNESCO Charter on the Preservation of the Digital Heritage, warning that we are risking losing access to all kinds of scientific, administrative, cultural, traditional resources, especially because we have come to rely so much in our culture, in our organizations, in our institutions on computing and on communicating with other people through networks of computers. And the instability of the internet is an additional risk for knowledge, as their charter says. So I took that kind of as one way to organize the introduction to the book. Here you see the first page on the right and the charter on the left, trying to unfold the various implications of that very high-minded and well-intentioned declaration from UNESCO about our digital heritage and the various aims in trying to preserve what we call that heritage. So if you look at the table of content, you'll see that there are different steps to that, as in most academic books. First chapter will be more conceptual framing, more theoretical background, simulation, not just as a technical aspect, but as a historical and conceptual theoretical construct, or what I call a cultural technique, right? So it's a way to use media to manipulate symbols and communications about things. So it's a second order technique. And then there are a couple of chapters that follow pretty closely on one another, even though you don't see that naturally reflected in the table of contents, from computer museums to computer music to online computing and gaming, to serious games and how they reflect the computerization of higher education. I'm going to focus today, because of who this group mostly it tends to attract, and because of our sponsor, the Paul Gray Museum, on chapter 2, which is about museums of computing and the challenge that they face, in addition to having to cover something that rapidly recedes into the past, namely the history of computing. They also have to try to face the internet as a very, very popular and pivotal aspect of computing, while also presenting that on the internet. So there's some kind of Mobius strip dynamic going on, where you're seeing museums going online a lot more, maybe because their physical footprint is small or almost non-existent. Maybe because during the pandemic, they wanted to reach people despite having closed their doors. Maybe because they're collaborating with other holders of certain inventory, et cetera, but also because the internet is uh, core to what the history of computing has been driving us towards. So first of all, let me situate this as the as the two-pronged approach. On the one hand, we know that computing has been theoretically and practically formulated as a kind of universal machine, a kind of universal simulation. A computer, by definition, is able to emulate or simulate almost any other media, almost any other communications device. That was the theoretical foundation as formulated by Turing and Church and others in the 1940s. That's how the first and second generations are built. I'm going to show you a couple of examples in a moment, but generally, the epistemic knowledge, the insight that can be generated by our experimenting and interacting with simulations is often a future scenario, right? So we're exploring liquid dynamics of various climate change factors, or we're exploring chain reactions in modeling nuclear physics, or epidemics and their likely or not so likely mitigation, etc. So all of those kind of scenarios, simulations, stage a world that's as close as possible, so you can manage the complexity of that model and tame the unpredictability of what it tries to model in chains of decision trees. What if, that computers are very good, oriented mostly towards the avoidance of certain outcomes, right? The problem with that is that these kinds of simulations, it can be very powerful, but they provide solutions or options only for exactly what they have made conceivable, for exactly the knowledge, the data set that they have. One of my neighbors just 3 doors down is a very prominent scientist in the international climate change physics panel, and is an expert on using simulation for those kinds of ends. And they face 2 problems. One, to have sufficient data, but not too much to overwhelm what their setup is able to crunch. And 2, to then communicate the result of that in ways that aren't oversimplifying or omitting variables, etc. What's interesting to me, though, is that the same technique also lends itself not just to a present or future orientation, but turning towards computing's own recent past. We call that emulation rather than simulation for various reasons. And we can parse the difference maybe in the discussion. But emulating can serve the maintenance and preservation of computational performance. And we can see that that's the case in a number of different directions. Once computing became fast enough to support such complex operations, it could not only furnish simulation for vividness, enriching, and further enlarging, and making more detailed, making more plausible certain kinds of models that will then strike observers as more clear and more convincing. More important, perhaps even than that, in the STEM fields in particular, is simulation for deduction and exploration, because being richer in data makes all kinds of hypothetical questions much more tractable, helps us explore them in new dimensions. And then there's also the third angle, which interests me in particular, which is simulation as an archive, whereby collections can also store expert systems and the collected knowledge of almost entire disciplines. And at this point, for any of the humanities members in the audience, I have to distance myself from traditional pejorative meaning that we see in the history of the word, that we see reflected in dictionaries all the way into the early 20th century, whereby simulation was mere copying or pretending. What I talk about here is not that pejorative sense, but really an epistemic technique, a modeling technique that uses computational means, from wargaming to flight simulators, from radar screens to immersive graphic user interfaces, to interact with very, very complicated, nonlinear, or otherwise artificial worlds. One old and nice museum example of that is the Heath Robinson. Here you'll see on the right hand a protocomputer, an analog computer that uses vacuum tubes or valves, as the Brits called them, and paper strips on rolls and relays. And it's a very noisy, clunky device that basically reverse engineers the Lorentz teleprinter that you see here on the left, which was a cipher machine used by the Nazi High Command during World War II period. It's less popular, less well known than the Enigma, but it was actually more secure and more trusted. And so the Allies collaborating, the Poles, French, British, Americans collaborating at institutions, including Bletchley Park, couldn't simply just get their hands on one of these devices. You can see there's a multi-rotor encryption device. Every time that you change the settings and you use passwords and other things, you are mathematically complicated the process of decrypting what has been encrypted with that. So the Heath Robinson, or what Americans might call a Rube Goldberg, is the same kind of joke, is a very complicated and clunky kind of machine that tries to reverse engineer another machine. And that's sort of the birthplace of the computer. One of the birthplaces of the computer is Second World War, reverse engineering of machines by other machines. And to my amazement, people at Bletchley Park have kept many of these devices in working order. You can go to England. It's about the same distance from Oxford and Cambridge and London. For strategic reasons, it's not in the cities, but it's close for all the academics and government employees that they wanted to recruit from those areas in the countryside. And it's really amazing to see and hear and interact with machines from the 1940s that still work. There's too few museums that are able to do that. It's implausible to keep all our machines running and in good order and let people get their hands on at the same time. Until recently, Paul Allen's collection in Seattle was able to do that, but when he passed away, of course, his sister, auctioned off pieces, not as a museum, but as individual collecting pieces. So it's rare that a museum is able to do that. Often we just get, a beige box behind glass, which is not quite the same. So that's simulation kind of at the origin of what computers do and what computers are conceived as doing. Emulation, strictly speaking, only comes into the history of computing in the early 60s when IBM came out with a new generation of machines. System 360 was quite different from the machines that they had been selling and leasing before in the 50s and 60s. So in order to persuade their existing customers in government, in large insurance companies and banks, etc., that they should upgrade to the newer generation of devices, they needed to make sure that people who had been using older devices could still work with their demographic or actuarial or financial data set that they had been using until just before that switch over. So engineers at IBM came up with the phrase emulation, with the word emulation, for using software and microcode and hardware to enable one computer to act as a host for another system, which then can run on that as a guest. And in some ways, that's a very legitimate strategy also for the history of computing in general and for computer museums in particular, because they often find it impossible to retain working examples of every computer or every piece of software or game or scenario or whatever it might be. Um, Attempting to do so it usually turns out to be prohibitively expensive and labor intensive. You need to have a lot of spares, and you need to have people who can reverse engineer certain cables and other things that wear out. So emulation in that scenario promises continued access to digital information into the future. It's a kind of software translation. In the early days, it also does involve hardware, but mostly these days it's a software transcoding that allows you to present an environment to a binary data set that behaves just like the original target environment, even though it isn't that machine. And it works, among other things, because we mostly assume that newer computers have higher attack rates and larger storage and throughput abilities than older ones. So they can do their own operation and on top of that, emulate the older device. Um, I've actually come across a PhD publication from the late 1970s that did a study of a top 5 insurance company at that time in the United States, looking at their computational needs and habits. And they saw that there were no less than 7 layers of emulation on top of each other to make sure that this big insurance company could continue to work with actuarial data sets and probabilities, sort of turtles all the way down. In a museum, of course, this is very useful because if we want to experience the look and feel of a computing environment that's no longer accessible outside of a specialized museum like the Paul Allen Museum, Living Computer Museum in Seattle, which is closed. That's where I took that picture on the left. It's a DEC System 10. You see the chair. Yes, the chair is on the other side of a little wire because only one person at a time was going to be allowed to touch those beautiful buttons. But you can see that there's a sheet with instructions and so on. It was in fully working, noisily working condition at the time. Now I don't have that access anymore. So I can go to GitHub and fire up the emulating software. There are many such things online, often labors of love by hobbyists or by veterans of the computer industry who have provided that kind of framework of emulation online, sharing it or even running it on the web in some cases. Quite impressive given that we know how incompatible computers used to be with each other. Of course, the internet is one response to that incompatibility of computers in the 60s with one another and in the 70s. Gamers, of course, know emulators because you might want to be playing older games. You might be particularly interested in retro gaming. You might be nostalgic for earlier console or PC games. You can load up an emulator. Museum professionals also use a specific set of tools. For example, Dioscuri is emulation platform for museums and museum history, computer history. Funders are listed here on the website that I clipped on the left. It's dedicated to exhibiting certain kinds of software and hardware environments in circumstances where you can't preserve in perfect working order or even in full part configuration the older devices. So we see that in museums, we see that in game history, in computer history, and we also see it in commercial applications. Anybody who's ever tried to use an Apple program on a Windows machine or a Windows machine program on a Linux machine will know about virtual systems, virtual OS, emulators like Parallels and others. Of course, mobile app development relies on that very prominently. If I want to make sure that my app both works on Android and on the iPhone, I will make use of an emulator that shows me exactly the dimensions of that screen, the resolution of that screen that each Android or iPhone device is expected to have, the input-output affordances, etc. So it can be a commercial service as well to emulate. There are retro computing emulators like the multiple arcade machine emulator that allows us to play all kinds of older devices. And then there are historiographical emulators like Dioscuri or SimH. Nonetheless, that does not take the pressure off computer museums. There are stories from around the world, Australia, Canada, the United States, Europe. I've come across a number of computer history museums that had to close shop for various reasons, sometimes because they ran into a storage crisis, sometimes because they ran out of money support, sometimes because they just simply did not have the sufficient technical expertise locally to fulfill the vision that they were founded with. For example, the idea of the Australian Computer Museum was that it would represent faithfully everything that has gone into the Antipodean computer history, the industry there in New Zealand and Australia. And they just realized that, even though that may not be a super concentrated center of computer history development, they couldn't actually execute their mission. And sometimes all that remains is a website or an online presence. Sometimes they merge with others. And it raises certain questions about what computer history museums are and what they should do, what they have to do, what we want them to do. Now, if we define a museum in general as an institution that collects and documents and preserves and, of course, exhibits and interprets evidence and context to make certain things, such as computing, widely accessible, then it's plausible to see that the internet itself has come to simulate some of those functions. And until museums reconfigured computing and the internet as special collections or recollections of that history, the net of computers itself kind of served as a form of historic retention. But at the same time, we know that the internet is aging badly. 70% of tweets are gone. and no longer findable after about a couple months. More than half of all the links in Wikipedia are not currently working, and that's just the web. If you get into other kinds of software layers and network layers and infrastructural layers, it's even more complicated. And anytime that computer museums rely on replicas and emulations, they're possibly undermining their claim to present authentic, erratic, special kinds of devices and experiences. So all the museums do that. They all have replicas. They all have emulations. They all have websites, almost all of them that I know about. But there's a trade-off between presenting the original things, but withdrawing them from their meaningful interactions and presenting simply a semblance of the original experience, by not having to withdraw it completely, but then maybe not faithfully showing it. So once you include going online in the history of computing, we face some even more wicked problems than just preserving the legacy of computer hardware and software, because now we're facing the additional challenge of telling the story of why computers are so important to us once they become networked, once they become connected to other computers and allow us to connect to other people through that network. So imagine how we might study the history of just the late 20th and early 20th century, not a very long history, without having any recourse to the web, the net, to software and to hardware. More and more of the primary sources of interest to any kind of historian are online, and more museums are going online, not just because of the pandemic, but even before that. Once museums go online, the question is who gets to represent what about the internet to whom on the internet? What is the history of the internet a history of? How do we cultivate awareness of the historical conditions of possibility of the internet? It never ceases to amaze me that the internet is older than I am, and yet there are some fundamental misrepresentations of how it started, who funded it, who developed it, who contributed to it, how it's defined, how it deals with certain policy and technical questions, etc. We because of marketing and because of other cultural factors, we get a lot of excitement and hype about the present and the future. So it's actually kind of weirdly interesting to see that at a certain point, the history of computing suddenly became museum worthy. And I have a slightly polemical take on that. It's not a coincidence that museums of computing are popping up in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, around the world at a certain point, at a certain inflection point in that history. And before I get to that polemic, I just want to remind everybody that regardless of whether you're looking at large institutions like the Smithsonian as a network of museums, or small dedicated institutions, whether you're looking at institutions that are started by corporate actors in the industry, or whether you're looking at academic research approaches to that history, the question always is, how can any of these institutions be comprehensive enough to tell that story persuasively, inclusively, from the analog and early digital to mainframes and mini computers and microcomputers and personal computers and decentralized networks and the internet? How can that be done when it's like a never-ending story, a looping story that has all kinds of technical and curatorial challenges? It's not a surprise to anybody who looks at museums that the first collections and exhibitions started as personal collections. even here in California, the most established ones that get the most headlines, like the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, started as a personal collection at DEC in Boston by people who were realizing that their own industry was growing very, very quickly, and they wanted to reflect the role of DEC and its partners, its business partners in that history. But as we know, private collections are not museums. They're sort of a pre-historical step, a chamber of curiosity, a Wunderkammer. Um, we need to demand a little more of a museum than of a private curiosity cabinet. It's not a vanity project. It's really something of a service to a general or a specialized audience. And that general or specialized audience didn't really agree on where to begin the history of computing. It didn't really converge on institutions that would help us articulate the history of computing. So yes, it's true that the Charles Babbage Institute in Minnesota and American Federation of Information Processing Societies were both founded in the late 70s. But it's also true that most computer museums only opened in the 1990s. So the CBI and the AFIPS, when they started collecting things, it was actually papers. It was not hardware. It was not even software. It was papers. It was concepts, ideas, but not devices and not code. So why do museums around the world in Europe and the United States and Asia open just in a few years before the end of the 20th century? I think it's not a coincidence that this is also when the internet was privatized and commercialized, when the backbone was commercialized, when it was very quickly giving itself over to a dot-com boom and investment rush. And of course, computing quickly became more ubiquitous, right? So that excess capital was then partly invested in telling the story of what allowed that to become reality, what allowed computers to take such a prominent role in contemporary life. So there's a little bit of airbrushing of corporate reputation that's implied here. Um, but I don't want to go on too long. I'd like to have some discussion, some back and forth. I'm just going to put the cover here on again as my last slide and point out that I'm happy if you feel like buying the book, but you don't have to. You can also find it directly from the MIT website in open access. That link here at the bottom of the page will take you to the direct to open version where you can download PDFs either of the chapters separately or of the whole thing. And with that, I'm happy to take any comments or questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. And this is really something that's valuable to like our particular collaboration between CISAD and the School of Arts and Humanities in terms of like the professional development for museum study students, like the particular challenges that computer museums face is, and the fact that they like are not something that's solved is kind of what we're working with like for the museum studies program. And all of you, I would encourage you to go read the book, especially like that chapter if you're interested in the challenges that computer museums face, because there is a lot of great discussion on it. We do have a couple questions, mostly from Jim. So for context, Peter, you probably don't know Jim, but he was involved with the Jim. I forget what your specific role was. I think in acquisitions we talked about it, but he was involved with the Computer Museum of America in San Diego that closed in 2006, and which of whose collection is currently housed at SDSU. So he has some great questions about, from personal insight into the struggles that computer museums face. So the first one is, in terms of historic preservation, do simulation and emulation risk misremembering or misrepresenting the actual tactile experience of using previous technology? By that, I mean that running an Apple II or TRS-80 emulator on a modern PC is not the same experience as using an Apple II or TRS-80, just as using a flight simulator isn't the same experience as flying a World War II bomber. So I'd add to that also, like what you think like the value of that tactile experience is for understanding computer history.
Absolutely. That's a very core concern to anybody who is both motivated to preserve, document, understand, communicate the history properly and not misremember it or misrepresent it. At the same time, suffers the constraints that we have um, obsolete hardware, incompatible software, that we have bit rot and other things to contend with. I'll see your question and even go one further. One thing that I have some fun recounting in the introduction to the book is that and we often place Charles Babbage's analytical engine at a beginning, a start point of computing, right? This is a 19th century device, um, never fully built, funded very generously by the British government and private fortunes. When one pioneering computer professional in the 20th century, John Walker, who is perhaps best remembered for Autodesk and other software enterprises, wanted to create an online exhibit devoted to Charles Babbage's analytical engine. He not only put documentation online, right? He also provided a Java emulator of Babbage's blueprints. And John Walker, in this exhibit, and he calls it a museum, even though it's just an online, presence, a website, placed sufficient premium on the emulation's authenticity that he felt the need to compose a lengthy essay about exactly that question that Jim put in the chat. Um, do simulation or emulation risk misremembering or misrepresenting the actual history? This is a little odd because, in fact, Babbage's analytical engine was never, in fact, built. So even the most detailed and painstaking emulator cannot be authentic in a historical sense. But John Walker's point that in order to be useful, an emulator must be as authentic or as faithful in replicating the behavior of the machine that it's emulating surely stands, right? You can't play fast and loose without risking either detail or resolution or aspects that are crucial historically or otherwise, especially if you want to use that not just as a museum thing, but in order to put it into a context that allows us to tell other stories. So every museum that I've visited, and I've been privileged to travel a bit to go to different museums of computer history, has replicas, has emulators, and the people who put them together and the people who decide whether or not to use them in exhibits always worry about that trade-off. In the end, usually the answer is, I would rather make available a replica or an emulator that I can allow people to touch and interact with than to have a broken or incomplete version of a machine behind bulletproof glass with museum lights that dim when nobody's looking because the thing is more valuable than my house. And we all know museums are like that. That can increase the imaginary or real aura of the exhibit, but it decreases any kind of pedagogical or historical or museological claim that the exhibit can make.
Awesome. Thank you. And I just want to say one way we deal with that trade-off is we do, because we don't have anybody staffing the lobby, because it's just me and my intern, we do have stuff behind glass, but when people ask for tours, Sophie's in here, and we gave her class a tour. You can come in and I'll bring stuff out for you to use and play with. So if any of you ever want to come into the museum and use some vintage computers, send me an email to pc.museum@cgu.edu. So there's, sorry, just a plug for having people like, know that that option is there. And one other question from Jim. So what role do the various vintage computer and gaming festivals, so like hobby groups and like retro computing enthusiasts, play in preserving computer cultural history in your view?
On the one hand, I want to say, that's the core audience to which many of these museums address themselves, right? Um, but then I'm also grumpy old man enough to say that, fan service isn't really enough of a mission statement. In academia, we don't necessarily see our role that way. Other institutions of memory, cultural memory, I include universities there, but also libraries, archives, and museums, um, are not necessarily in the business of um, organizing festivals or LAN parties or retro gaming competitions. That's a separate thing. So sometimes there's a logical overlap. I do know that some museums do exactly what Anna was describing. There's a very beautifully curated small museum of computing in Cambridge, England, that does that, especially with their game devices. There are certain days when you're allowed to come in or even take them out, despite the fact that these are rare and difficult to repair and replace. But it does make them accessible and interactable, etc. So it's the same kind of trade-off. Even the largest computer history museum that I'm aware of, which is in the middle of nowhere in central northern Germany, the Heinz Nixdorf Museum, also started from a private collection, became huge. Nixdorf sold his company to IBM, and now it's owned by a foundation. They are, at least in terms of exhibition footprint and um, machines that they show, the largest. But even they cannot possibly show everything that they have in their warehouse and in their storage. So festivals and get-togethers and hobby groups and collector groups. I'm part of several email discussion groups and web forums that are devoted to that. They're possibly more important in the margins than we realize, because those are the people who figure out how to reverse engineer a certain part, how to machine something, etc. And then they will end up offering their services also to the supposedly better funded and more highly professional museums. So there's a natural synergy, but there are really two different kinds of scenes. I don't think that museums want to be in the business of festival play or festival computing, collectors items, etc. There are other functions that I try to summarize in the official definition of what the Museum Association says museums should be doing in order to call themselves museums. And it goes way beyond preservation or collecting.
Awesome. Thank you. We have a couple, oh wait, really one other big question. Jim did want to remark that in the Computer Museum of America, they started their computer history timeline with the abacus. So,
Yeah.
counting machines.
It's a fair point. There's a really, really smart, small academic computer history museum in Stuttgart, which is a high-tech university, where they start with the abacus and with a large collection of calculating machines, accounting machines, cash machines, etc., from the Baroque to the 19th century. And they will not let you look at their amazing 20th century computers until you have gone through a rudimentary understanding of calculating and accounting methods and so on. That's a logical route, but not everybody finds that, the most seductive in. Most large museums of computing want to lure people in either with gaming or with the internet as the two aspects of interactive computing that are now the most widespread in practice. And it's no longer a specialized field. It's no longer a mathematical field. It's no longer a STEM related field. It's an everything field, right? Everybody has a computer of sorts in their pocket, carrying it around to do all these things. We call it a phone, but it's really a computer. And a lot of people never use the so-called phone function of their smartphone. So that's just as plausible an entry point if you're trying to interest a general audience in your still rather specialized story. But yes, I do say go back to the abacus, go back to the calculating machines, go back to the history of secret communications, secure communications, include other networks, including the telegraph and the telephone in the story of telling the story of the internet, etc. That to me, as an academic, that makes sense. But maybe I'm not the typical audience member there either. You'll get the flavor when people tell that story differently.
Totally. One question from Tony. I recall a documentary, Triumph of the Nerds. How do museums deal with the players that help usher in this revolution? And I recall in a not too old interview with Grace Hopper saying we are at the beginning of this. I am sure this is a common question, but what does the past say about the future in that regard? So, Tony, if I understand you right, you're asking about how the how museums narrativize um the people involved in making computer history in addition to just the hardware and how those um how that impacts how we tell the story of the hardware.
Yeah, are you actually putting a finger on something that I've been trying to tell better, tell differently? So unfortunately, the main the main reason that people know the name Grace Hopper is because there are some journalistic accounts of why we call something that doesn't work on a computer a bug. So there's an anecdotal origin of debugging. And there's, we also are happy and proud to see prominent female figures in the history of computing that has been told a long time as a great man story or a great machine story. To me, actually, it's much more interesting to tell the story of Admiral Hopper as somebody who had insight and expertise in using computers for quite sensitive and important and subtle roles, including code breaking. And I don't know if that's the interview that you're referring to, but there are some really interesting lectures, a series of 3 lectures that Grace Hopper gave at NSA that were declassified only a few months ago. So they were posted online on the NSA website in the fall. And I'm not sure that I have a link now, but anybody who can't find it should email me or Anna, and I'll pass that around. So there's a lot of, and the general point is this: there's a lot of developments in the history of computing that we don't know enough about because some of that work was done under a shroud of secrecy or confidentiality or national security. This is true of the early work that Alan Turing did, but for a long time it was not understood what his actual role was, not just a mathematical, theoretical role, but a very hands-on role at Bletchley Park, at Manchester, involved in building early digital computers. And that is true of a number of devices that were I see the Hopper lectures posted in the chat. Thank you. A number of devices built in Ohio at a company that ostensibly, officially only built factory devices, but in fact was building replicas of computers built in the UK. So there are a lot of things in the history of computing that are sometimes declassified very slowly or belatedly, and then we have to revise the way that we tell the story, for example, of early computing or of 60s computing or even of 70s, let alone into the 80s and 90s. I'm in touch with some people who are trying to uh, publicize some of the things that we should know and that we can know. But even things that are not really that touchy or complicated, like Grace Hopper's lectures, are kind of publicized very belatedly. So with figures like that, with important pioneers, female pioneers, we sometimes only appreciate their importance too little and too late. There are other figures like that that I try to use in my teaching, to the extent that I use my classes to smuggle in stories about the history of computing, regardless of what the class is called. And I'm always eager to get more material, even though that's not my only field of interest or expertise. So yeah, and there's a lot of delay in the discovery and communication about the history of computing.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. We are just about out of time. Let me send this answer to Tony real quick. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap us up. I want to remind you all that this is an ongoing speaker series that we host about twice a year. So keep your eyes out for our events and subscribe to our blog if you want event announcements. The recording for this webinar will be posted on CGU's YouTube channel, and we'll link to it on our website once it's up if you want to reference it yourself or send it to a friend who missed the event. I'm going to send a survey out after the event, just about your experience. Quick survey about your experience with decoding the past in general and this event in particular. So keep an eye out for that as well. Super helpful for us if you fill that out. It helps us improve our programming. And thank you all so much for attending, and thank you, Peter, for your presentation and for the Q&A. And hopefully I will see you all next time.
Thanks for setting up.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.